Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian military operation in Ukraine. Russian forces are continuing their attempted push through Ukraine from multiple directions, while Ukrainians, led by President Volodymyr Zelensky, are putting up stiff resistance, according to U.S. officials. On February 24th, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation. Ukraine accused Russia of heavy shelling and missile attacks, many on civilian buildings, that continue in Ukraine's capital, Kiev, as well as other major cities like Kharkiv and Mariupol. Many questions are raised about the development of the situation between the real poles behind this conflict. Our panel of guests will answer some of these questions through a detailed analysis. We have via Skype Dr. Abdulnoor Toumi, journalist and Maghreb studies expert at Orsam, Turkey, from France, along with David Powell, commentator on Arab and international affairs from London, as well as Alexei Harin, professor of comparative politics in Kiev, Mohilek University from Ukraine. Thank you for all guests for joining us. The discussion begins right after this break. And these are the latest updates on the Russia-Ukraine file. Vladimir Putin threatens to stop gas supplies to unfriendly countries if they don't deal in the Ukraine currency or the Russian currency from Friday. Ukraine tops agenda at EU-China annual summit. Ukraine foreign minister says he spoke with Polish authorities about blocking movement of Russian exports and imports across Poland. Death toll rises to 28 from strike in Ukraine's Mykolaiv. The Kremlin said Friday that a reported Ukrainian airstrike on fuel depot in western Russia will hinder future peace talks. And to talk more about the energy matter, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that some of the foreign buyers of natural gas, whom Moscow calls unfriendly countries, have to pay the Russian gas in rubles starting from today, Friday. But the German Chancellor declared his country aid. He expects his country will continue to be able to pay for Russian gas in euros. Let's follow.
On Thursday, U.S. President Joe Biden gave his strongest authorization of oil, ordering an unprecedented release of emergency U.S. crude, in a move that gambled his climate-saving credentials on decreasing fuel prices.
Today, I'm authorizing the release of 1 million barrels per day for the next 6 months, over 180 million barrels for the from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This is a wartime bridge to increase oil supply until production ramps up later this year. And it is by far the largest release of our national reserve in our history. It will provide a historic amount of supply for a historic amount of time, a 6-month bridge to the fall.
Biden stated that it's time to invest in the urgent production to respond to Vladimir Putin and give relief for consumers, not investors and executives. The economic advisor to Joe Biden said that the global supply is down because of Russian oil and that the U.S. and its allies are working together to combat high prices.
We're confident that our allies and partners will provide tens of millions of barrels additional into the market. So we're looking at...
The White House Director of Communications explained the additional sanctions on Moscow and how important the efficiency of the sanctions is.
Today we announced additional sanctions on Russian technology companies that enable Putin's war of choice. We will prevent them from procuring Western technology and evading our severe sanctions. We're also expanding our sanctions authority to target additional sectors of the Russian economy important to Putin, including aerospace, maritime, and the electronic sectors.
The U.S. is insisting on addressing the economic problem, but the move gambled Biden's climate-saving credentials and his long-term renewable energy and climate ambitions, according to analysts and climate advocates.
Dr. Abdulnoor Toumi, let me start with you first. Welcome to our show. And this is my following question. We see that despite the promises of Russia to stop its offensive on Ukraine cities, and despite the attempts of diplomatic talks and Ukraine's compromise of neutrality, we see the war still lingering on. And now the energy card is flat out on the table. How do you read this, Doctor?
First of all, good afternoon, and thank you for having me. Good afternoon to your distinguished guest. Yes, I mean, the war it's still going, despite the ray of hope that came out last week in the Istanbul. And this is interesting. I mean, this is a part of the war and peace equation. And the Russians knew well that their first strategy operation didn't work at all, and it looks like there is a shift in strategy from the Russian side, and this is why now they are focusing on the east side and mainly actually the Donbas region. Now they are moving and to keep the Mariupol neighbors and putting all their now operation on that area. But nonetheless, they are still looking at the on the others, northern part, and looking forward to eventually keep going and besiege Kiev, which is going to be very, very tough and hard operation to achieve. So on this stance, President Putin is still using the gas card, and he knew well that now to destabilize his adversaries and also trying to send double message, to the international community and notably the Western allies who are explicitly supporting Kiev. On the other hand, it's showing some, I would say, timid strength toward his domestic audience, therefore his people.
Very nice. Thank you so much. Now, let me move on to you, Dr. David Powell. Is Europe ready to replace Russian energy products? We see Blinken, for example, touring around different OPEC member countries in a bid to urge them to pump more energy products into European market. Nevertheless, even if they accept, which is unlikely, the crisis isn't going to be resolved anytime soon on the ground. How true is that, Doctor?
Well, you're right. I mean, there's a contradiction here in a sense, or an equilibrium, really, that the international community is trying to strike. On the one hand, it's trying to stop buying Russian oil and gas in order to reinforce the sanctions. But at the same time, we have an energy crisis, an international energy crisis. So, as you say, Secretary Blinken and others are trying to urge other suppliers in the Gulf, North Africa, to increase the supply of gas particularly to Europe, to make up for Russian gas, and it's a difficult balance, and it's a difficult a task to achieve that. I mean, for instance, although European countries have imposed unprecedented sanctions, they are still buying Russian oil and gas. The pipelines are still open, and some countries have stopped completely, but countries in Europe are still buying gas. Germany, notably, although it stopped the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was a huge move in the initial phase of the conflict. European countries are still purchasing Russian gas and oil. And today, the Russian foreign minister is in India, because India is a country that's extremely important for Russian energy exports, and he wants to keep India buying gas and oil as it continues to do. Or the British Foreign Secretary was also in India a couple of days ago to try and stop India buying Russian gas. So it's an ongoing struggle to try and cut off Russian gas supplies to reinforce the sanctions, but at the same time safeguard or replace that energy with energy from other supplies to stop this crisis in gas supplies, gas prices across Europe.
Mm-hmm. Very nice indeed. What about you, Professor Alexei Harid? How do you see Ukraine's compromise of neutrality deal? Wasn't it a categorical refusal to be neutral before? What changed now? And if this is materialized on the ground, isn't this going to give Russia a veto power over NATO nations as to who can and cannot join?
Look, first of all, we need to understand that all Russians talk about the threat from NATO is a bluff. As I have said repeatedly on your program, Russia attacked Ukraine in 2014 when Ukraine had non-bloc status, official non-bloc status, and when support for NATO was low. So after Russian attack on Ukraine, yes, we were trying to find security guarantees from NATO. At this point, we can consider the model of security outside of NATO, which is non-bloc, but we need really hard security guarantees in case of future attack. From whom? You can guess. This is Russia. So basically, we need hard security guarantees from, first of all, Western countries. And if these guarantees are provided, then we can discuss it. But, these guarantees shouldn't be paper-type guarantees, like it was in Budapest Memorandum, when there was no mechanism, there was no procedure, what kind of guarantees, and so on and so forth. We need really security guarantees. It means that Ukraine should have very strong army, that Ukraine would be provided with weapons, and in case of attack on Ukraine, there would be imposition of no-fly zone and harder supply of weapons and harder economic sanctions on Russia. If this is provided, then we can discuss a model of security outside of NATO.
So, Professor Oleksiy Harin, you're saying that the military aid that Ukraine that was receiving from Western nations isn't enough?
Definitely not. First of all, the supply of Western weapons was too late. We do not have air defense systems. We do not have planes, and this is really important, to secure Ukrainian civilians from attacks by Russia. And I would like to remind that all Ukraine is attacked, all cities. Actually, today I got to know that one of my daughters, who was in Lviv, so she evacuated with Poland, but unfortunately she has post-traumatic syndrome after aerial attacks, because she experienced these attacks both in Kiev and then in Lviv, which is very close to Polish border. So you can imagine the situation. My another daughter is staying in Kiev and going to the bomb shelter. The same is for me. So definitely we need air defense systems. And at this point, we are not provided it. Then we need not only defensive weapons, but also offensive weapons like tanks. Why? Because we need to liberate those cities which are occupied. And we cannot do it, just with nice words. As you know, Ukrainian army is now counterattacking. Russians are withdrawing in some places, but we do not have enough weapons. So we understand that NATO is not going to fight for us. Okay, give us weapons.
Very nice. Dr. David Powell, as Professor Oleksiy Harin was saying that Ukraine needs more military aid and real, concrete security guarantees. Now, isn't Russia going to be alerted if such aid is provided to Ukraine? And perhaps it would urge it to continue the offensive and perhaps escalate the situation even more.
Well, I mean, there is no sign that this war is going to come to an end quickly. So one can understand why the Ukrainians want extra weapons to fight in self-defense. And countries are providing. I mean, the US has promised extra weapons. The UK Defence Minister today announced that Britain would be supplying artillery to try and counter the Russian artillery. So weapons are going in. And as for provoking Russia, well, I mean, Russia is provoked anyway. It wouldn't really make much difference. The West has been supplying weapons to Ukraine since the beginning of the war. So they're going to continue to do that. The question is, what will this lead to? And as Professor Harin referred to, the Russians, although they seem to be withdrawing from areas north of Kiev and around Kharkiv, and concentrating more on the eastern side of the country, and as the deputy chief of Russian Defense Staff announced about a week ago that the focus was going to be on the Donbass region, on the liberating, as he put it, occupying the Donbass region, and it looks like that is the main focus now, to try and create a kind of pincer movement around the Donbass region, trapping Ukrainian forces in the east to secure that area. There is no guarantee that that would be the end of the story. I mean, nobody knows really what Vladimir Putin wants, whether he's really only wanting to take those eastern parts of Ukraine, or whether he's going to then move, once he's done that, move further west and again threaten the capital. So these are all unknowns.
Yes, indeed, which raises the question, like Russia's moves are very difficult to read. At the beginning, they were targeting certain cities, and now, as you said, they are focusing on the Donbass region. Dr. Abdelnour Toumi, what's your comment on this? Can we refer to this as a miscalculation from Russian part in its operation in Ukraine?
Yes, it is indeed, and I stated earlier, and this is what there is a shift in strategy from the Russians. This is why now they are going to focus on the Donbass area, and then focus to they are doing. To besiege Mariupol because it's a strategic point, and also keep the pressure on the northern part, and notably in Kiev. It's still Kiev. It is symbolic, but it's according or what we have been following during the last month of in the fight, and the resistance of the Ukrainians, it's going to be very, very hard for the Russians. Now, this is why now they can. It is a kind of they retreated from the north and focusing on again Donbass area and on the seaside of the Mariupol ports because it's strategic for them. But in here, what the Russians are trying, and also they're playing, the time factor, which is not going for them, it is to the contrary, it's going for the Ukrainians, and this is which will enhance the argument of the Ukrainians when they are there are news reports that there are talks and there is negotiation or talks process. This process that will make a progress depends on the developments on the ground, and therefore this for the Russians it could be kind of, I would say, timid exit strategy from the main or the global strategy that put in place on the day of the invasion. So now when they are again pressuring the Ukrainians further, and then when they go for the meeting, that was again in the news report that maybe there will be a meeting in 2 weeks or so between the two countries' foreign affairs ministers in Turkey. We will see. 2 weeks, it's a lifetime in politics, and especially in war, so we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. But it is still the strategy that the Russians now they're trying to follow.
Yes, and in the same context and in a video address, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the Russian troops are accumulating offensive potential, powerful offensives in the eastern Donbass region, in Mariupol and in the direction of Kharkiv. Let's listen.
In the Donbass, in Mariupol, and in the direction of Kharkiv, Russian troops are accumulating their offensive potential, powerful offensives. We will defend ourselves. We will do everything to stop the occupiers and cleanse our land of their wicked and absurd chimeras.
Let me get back to you, Dr. Abdelnour Toumi. Again, we see that there is no trust policy from Western nations, and the U.S. said it would directly, they would directly believe in actions and not words from the side of Russia. And here we have Ukrainian president warning a further potential offensive in the eastern Donbass region. Can you tell us why is this region very important to Russia? And is it true that Russia is trying to have two Ukraines, just like the case of South and North Korea?
Actually, it is important for the Russians because it's the main goal, of this invasion. When the Russians invaded Ukraine, is for to invade the global country. But then again, their operation, the initial operation didn't work. Now there is a shift in strategy, and now they are focusing on the Donbass area on the east side. And this is, again, there is psychological aspect here. To show, first of all, to boost the morale of their troops on the ground and even in the headquarters, and also to send a message to the Russians, inside Russia, about this operation. On the other hand, the Ukrainians are not going to give up. They will fight, and they will continue to fight to resist this occupation. However, this is why it's going, again, as I said, 2 weeks, when Turkish Foreign Minister Şovlu stated today that then there will be meetings in 2 weeks or so. 2 weeks, again, it's a lifetime in politics. So, and politics is full of irony, so that geopolitics. So we don't know what's going to happen. And how President Zelensky will, I would say, sustain this pressure that is on him, and from both sides. From the West, who are supporting the Western countries, who are supporting him, and also on his domestic fronts, because again, the Ukrainian resistance is not going to let it go easily and accept what will be.
And since we're just speaking in theory, Dr. David Powell, in case Russia is successful in its attempt, what would be the geopolitical scene like?
Well, it's successful in its attempt to what? To take the whole of Ukraine, or take the eastern part of Ukraine?
In any case scenarios, like we're discussing possibilities here.
Yeah. Well, I share Dr. Toumi's analysis, really, and I think there's no prospect, and I think there's an understanding internationally that there's no prospect of this war ending soon. There was some optimism when Russia announced its refocus on the east. This was read as a consequence of its inability to succeed in its initial blitzkrieg and take the capital and the whole of the country within days, as it apparently thought it would. And this led to some optimism that maybe Russia was reducing its war aims. I must say, it's very difficult to know whether that's the case, whether Russia is going to settle for taking the east of Ukraine and in order to keep it weak and destabilized and demilitarized, as it initially said, as it's done in other countries. Taking parts of Georgia, parts of Moldova, and holding on to these territories in order to intimidate and weaken and the central government in those countries. Whether that's the Russian tactics or not, it's very difficult to know. But there is no prospect.
How can we be optimistic, Dr. David Powell? And Russia, from the very beginning, they said that it was just a military drill, and then we noticed like an outright incursion in the country. How can we trust Russia's words, Doctor?
Well, precisely. That's precisely my point. If you remember, before the invasion began, when this huge buildup of Russian forces was taking place, and the US president and others warned that an invasion was imminent, the Russian leadership said this was NATO propaganda and there was no such invasion envisaged. So, a complete deception. So that's why any words from Russia are treated with immense skepticism. And we simply don't know what the Russians are planning. And the Ukrainians, on the other hand, of course, are fighting back. And there are only three ways, really, that a war ends. Either one side wins, or both sides realize they can't gain anything more by fighting, and will therefore talk, or there's some outside intervention. Neither of those three factors are at play in this case. So one can only envisage that this conflict is going to continue for the foreseeable.
Professor Oleksiy Haran, can you give us an insight reading on the situation on the ground right now? And what are your expectations on future Russian moves?
Well, we cannot believe any word of Russia. I fully agree here. We understand that, yes, Russian initial plan totally failed. So what they're going to do right now, yes, they would like to seize the whole Donbass. How it will, well, theoretically it may happen, though there would be huge Russian casualties here. But theoretically, it may happen. Will it change the calculation, political calculation? No, and military calculation? No, because Ukrainians will not agree to that. Ukrainians will continue to fight. What Russia did in Donbass, they actually infuriated all Russian speakers in this area. People are to leave Donbass. They're escaping Russian troops. So basically, Russia created the huge anti-Russian feeling among Russian speakers in Donbass. This may look like a paradox, but this is true. And this is what we were saying before, that it doesn't matter what language Ukrainians speak, they are the patriots of the country. So no Ukrainian government would agree to any territorial losses by Ukraine. I would like also to invoke here the question of mercenaries from Arab countries, because we are on Algerian TV. So it's important to understand that Russia has the lack of manpower. So they're trying to have mercenaries from other regions of the world, including Syria and Lebanon and Libya. So, and I would urge actually the Arab public to be very careful about that, because these killers may come to Ukraine. Again, I do not believe that it will change much in military equation, because they are not able to deliver some military successes, and basically they would be rebuffed and destroyed in totally different country, and the country which is going to defend itself. But these mercenaries may give much more crimes into Ukraine. So again, I urge Arab politicians and Arab public to stop any potential move of the mercenaries from the Arab countries to Ukraine. It will have, dramatic consequences for Arab world as well. Actually, Arab world now is suffering because Ukraine is one of the main exporters of the grain. So there would be grain shortage. The Arab countries will lose if the war continues. So do what you can to stop this war and to stop this brutal Russian aggression.
And in an attempt or important development, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has taken decisive action and fired 2 top security officials who he claimed were traitors. In an early morning address, the Ukrainian president announced he had sacked the chief of main department of the security service of Ukraine. Let's follow.
According to Article 48 of the Disciplinary Statute of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, those servicemen among senior officers who have not decided where their homeland is, who violate the military oath of allegiance to the Ukrainian people as regards to the protection of our state, its freedom and independence, will inevitably be deprived of senior military ranks. Random generals don't belong here.
Still with you, Professor Oleksiy Harin, how do you see this important development? How deep do you think is Russian intelligence infiltrating Ukrainian forces?
Well, definitely we knew about that Russia infiltrated Ukraine for many years. That's clear. But I would like to say that their main efforts were in vain. All information they received was miscalculated by Russia's top military command and Putin himself. So he never understood Ukraine. He doesn't understand Ukraine. So basically, Russians' calculations failed. Regarding these 2 generals, I do not have this information. So, well, perhaps Zelensky is right. I think he's right, because otherwise he wouldn't do that. But it just shows that, yes, we need to fight those Russian spies who are in our country. And don't forget that Russian spies are everywhere, not only in Ukraine. They are in Europe, and we know the chemical attacks they did in the UK. So Russian espionage network is very powerful. By the way, I remember how Russian special forces, they made political killing in Qatar, I believe, one of Chechen opposition leader. The other opposition Chechen leader, Muslim, he was killed in Berlin. So yes, Russians are very active in having these destabilization efforts, not only in Ukraine, but also in Europe and also in the Arab states.
Indeed. Dr. David Powell, perhaps you would like to comment on this. And how long do you think Ukraine is able to resist? Do you see that there is a possibility for the Ukrainian government to crumble and a pro-Russian one would be established? How likely is this?
Well, I think that was an initial aim of the invasion, to overthrow the Ukrainian government and install a puppet government that would carry out Moscow's wishes. I think that ambition has now been shelved because the ability to take any ministers, let alone the president of the country, has failed. The attack on the capital has failed. So I don't think there's any likelihood of a puppet government or a replacement government to that of Volodymyr Zelensky appearing anytime soon, unless there was a complete collapse. It's impossible to predict how wars go. As Professor Toomey said, 2 weeks is a long time in politics, and it's an awful long time on the battlefield. This war is barely 4 weeks, 5 weeks old, and incredible changes have taken place, completely unexpected resistance from the Ukrainian forces. So I think nobody could predict quite what resistance the Ukrainian forces would put up, and certainly it would be a very rash forecaster who said that Ukraine was going to collapse. It looks, from all the evidence from journalists, that the morale of the Ukrainian forces is much higher than that of the invading Russian forces. So if anyone's going to collapse, it would be more likely on the Russian side. But Russia has a huge military, it has huge resources, and as we've said, the income that sanctions is supposed to limit, the income to fund the invasion, to fund the military, is not total. So Russia can keep up this fight, unfortunately, for an unpredictable period. So. No, I don't see a Ukrainian collapse anytime likely. Why would they? The country is fighting for its existence, after all, and there's a people's army as well as a regular army. So, I mean, the population are mobilized by all the evidence. So one can only see the fighting going on. It's only possible to map it out and say where it's going to continue, but it's only going to continue.
Yes, definitely. Dr. Abdunnoor Toomey, how effective is Western nations' aid to Ukraine? What can these Western nations do more to protect their interest and alliance with Ukraine?
Actually, I mean, they are doing a lot because, I mean, in terms, I mean, as Professor Aran said, that it was a little bit late for providing, and in terms of, weapon supplies and so on. But in terms of intelligence, I mean, they had the Ukrainians a lot. And if the Ukrainian resistance is still going on and has become stronger, it is because of the help of the Western intelligence, and notably coming from the Americans. Now, as far as the collapse of the government in Ukraine, I think it is out of the all scenarios today. And interestingly enough, I mean, when we heard President Erdogan yesterday talking about an eventual or even possible meeting between President Putin and President Zelensky in Turkey, this will be a huge victory, I mean, symbolic for President Zelensky, because don't forget, I mean, as we all know, and even earlier Professor Powell stated, I mean, the aim or one of the main goals of this operation is to overthrow the Ukrainian government and replace it with another friendly government toward Russia. So this is out of the table, and this is why we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, because the imperatives of this war are changing and also setting a new parameters in the horizon.
And in a different development, Ukraine state nuclear company Energy Gotom said on Thursday that all Russian troops who occupied the Chernobyl nuclear power station after Russia started its military operation in Ukraine have left the plant inoperative. However, the head of the Ukrainian agency in charge of the area has said that some Russian troops are still in the exclusion zone around the defunct Chernobyl nuclear power station. I get back to you, Dr. David Powell. The whole world knows now that having nuclear power is an ultimate veto power. But being in the wrong hands, we can speak of serious threat to the existence of humanity in general. And the Russian defense minister once said in a special interview with CNN that if the existence of Russia is threatened, they can resort to nuclear weapons. How likely is that, Doctor?
Well, that was a huge concern in the early part of the conflict when President Putin made this threat of using tactical nuclear weapons in the conflict. This rang huge alarm bells. But of course, that's one of the reasons why NATO will not get involved directly in this conflict, because the idea of NATO forces directly confronting Russian forces is one that could open the way to such a development. So that's why NATO has been very clear in defining its red lines and not giving in to the demands, I mean quite understandable demands from requests rather than demands from President Zelensky for a no-fly zone, because that also would open up the possibility of direct confrontation between NATO forces and Russian forces, which is such a danger because it could escalate into a huge and possibly nuclear conflict. Also in the early part of the war, I mean, you mentioned the Chernobyl reactor. Also in the early part of the war, there was a reactor in the south of the country that came under bombardment from Russian forces. And this also rang huge alarm bells, of course, because if you start bombing nuclear power stations, that could also create an environmental disaster and threaten lives of people within Ukraine and indeed beyond. And it's interesting that since then, there's been no other reported further attacks on other nuclear power stations within Ukraine. So one can only hope that the Russian forces, the Russian military are themselves being careful about targeting power stations.
Dr. Abdel Toumi, don't you think that world leaders and world powers should be more humane? Don't we need a new world order, new rules?
Indeed, and I think they are human. I mean, they are human, I'm sure. I mean, they care about humanity as well. So this is why, I mean, the scenario of the nuclear clash will be, I mean, first of all, I don't think it will happen, and also would be an apocalyptic scenario. So indeed, I'm speaking of the new world order, and it is already on the table because we saw and we heard Russia, one of first minister, I mean, Lavrov, he mentioned that, and also the emerging of Turkey in this conflict as not only a raising state, but also as a stabilizing power in the region and in the globe order.
Yes. Dr. Oleksiy Harin, I would like to hear your opinion on what our distinguished guest just said earlier.
Well, there were so many questions raised. Maybe regarding New World Order, I would say that, well, it's clear what New World Order will not be. It will not be like President Putin expected, definitely. So, because we see a decisive response by international community to unprovoked Russian aggression, to the behavior of the country which is a member of Security Council. So this is very important. Putin didn't expect that. So, and now it's clear that Putin did huge mistake regarding the future of Russia. Because after this war, definitely what we see now is the Russian decline. Geopolitical, geo-economic, diplomatic, and moral decline. So the whole world have seen what are the so-called Russian world which Putin is proclaiming. So, and I think that Russia has already lost. Russia is defeated already. The question is, yes, the question is how long this war would continue and how many more lives of Ukrainians will be taken away by Russia. So yes, this is a very tragic development for my country. We are losing people, we are losing civilians, but it's clear that Ukrainian identity actually now is cemented. Ukrainian desire to fight for freedom is unique, and by doing that, we are not defending only Europe, we are defending Europe, and we are defending the whole world. As I have already explained in your program, what Putin has done in Ukraine, it's basically similar to what Hitler did, and basically similar to what Saddam Hussein did regarding Kuwait.
Okay. Thank you so much, Oleksiy Harin. We have come to a close. Our time has run out. Thank you so much, our distinguished guests, for joining us in this very vivid exchange. Thank you, David Powell, Oleksiy Harin, Abdel Tomi. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News with me, Karim Fazakari. This is the end of our special coverage for today. See you tomorrow. Bye for now.